Hello! Today I wanted to talk about Strange News from Another Star, which was originally published in Germany in 1919 as Märchen. Apologies for the pronunciation, but it's a series of short stories that Hesse has written. So originally there were 7 stories. However, at Hesse's request in the later publications of it, so my version is the 70s publication translated by Denver Lindley, they added an extra one, which is Flute Dream. And so we're clear on which book I'm talking about. In the 90s, there was also this one that was released. So I've got this Penguin Archive copy. And the difference is it's named Strange News from Another Planet instead of Star. It's missing some of the stories originally included in this, but they've added in some others. So it's Jack Zipes who does the translation, and he also is the one who translated the fairy tales of Hermann Hesse, which it's a bit more comprehensive. It includes, I think it's about 22 of his short fairy tale stories. But this one has A Man by the Name of Zagler added in, and If the War Continues as well. But in this review, I'll be concentrating on Strange News from Another Star. To discuss the books, I do end up covering some spoilers, so please be aware if you've not read it before. But I'm excited to talk about this book. I was a little torn on which one to do next, as it's the same year that Damien is published, but I thought this one has so many short stories that kind of bridge the gap. So we have some in here that are kind of touching on some of those themes that we see in Roshalde, Nulp, even Gertrude to a smaller extent, around the artist's life as a whole, whether or not they're made for a conventional married life. And then some of the stories in it also go a bit more surreal, which begins to link us into the Damien Hesse that we know. Now, while this was published in 1918, the stories within were actually written between 1913 and 1918. And this is really key because it was a really turbulent time in Hesse's life, and you can see how this influences his work over the years as well. So in between these stories being written, we have the First World War in Germany that's broken out. We have his wife being institutionalized after severe mental breakdown. His youngest son is really sick with meningitis. His marriage is falling apart. And thanks to some of the news articles that Hesse was publishing at the time around the war, he was receiving a lot of hate from Germany as well. So a really intense amount of turmoil that Hesse was going through in his life, and this led him to seek some help. In particular, it meant he started undergoing psychoanalysis with Dr. J.B. Lang, who was a student of Jung, who Hesse does see later in life, but not at this stage. He begins his sessions with J.B. Lang in 1916, and you can immediately see some of the influence coming through in the books. But let's begin with some of the stories in here. So the first 2, Augustus and the Poet, are written in 1913. And Augustus is still quite a simple fairy tale-esque story. It's a little more reminiscent of his earlier writing, and it follows the story of the little boy Augustus. So when he's a child, his mother is given the unique opportunity to make any one wish in the world for her son. She struggles at deciding what would be the right one, but in a state of panic, as she's running out of time to decide, she wishes that everyone would love Augustus, which feels like a really innocent wish at the time. And to begin with, it's kind of a blessing for Augustus. Everyone's really kind to him, he does well with all the girls, he's rarely presented with many obstacles, but as time goes on, it's clear how this becomes more of a curse to Augustus than anything positive. And he ends up getting to the point where he's considering ending his life and is about to commit suicide. And it's at this point that the man returns, who is the one who granted his mother the wish in the first place. And Augustus has the unique opportunity to wish for something else. And so after thinking long and hard about this, rather than being loved by everyone, he instead changes the wish to have the capacity to love others. And so the tale is kind of talking about the dangers of being a narcissist. But I think it's one that, if you've got kids, it could be great to make them read, as there's some sweet lessons in there for younger people. The Poet, however, is one of the main reasons that I wanted to talk about this book next, as it ties in so well with those themes in Roshalde and Nulp. Now, The Poet is about a Chinese poet named Han Fuke. which is pulling upon Hesse's own experiences and travels, as in 1916 he writes the essay In Remembrance of India. And in this he's talking about his trip that he made in 1911. But just to be clear, Germany refers to Far India as being Southeast Asia. While he states India, he's also including places like Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia. The translations are a little unclear on exactly where he means. But within this essay, he's quite positive about the experience, which is interesting because when you read his diary entries from this trip, there's quite a contrast. He's quite cynical, he's disappointed at the amount of European influence that's already seeping its way through. He had really high expectations of what he was hoping to receive there, searching for enlightenment, finding new answers, but he found kind of the begging for money and a lot of things to be really disruptive. But as the years go on, the more he reflects on this trip, the more he refers to it as being quite positive, and this essay is one of the examples of it. But one of the things that he does take away from the trip is a new appreciation for Chinese religions and ways of thinking. He keeps Taoism and Lao Tzu as an influence, and the Chinese influence is very much echoed in the poet as well. So the poet Han Fuke at the start of the story is offered the opportunity for marriage. So there's a bride he's about to marry. His father has this whole life for him, but he wishes to forgo all of this and follow his dream of becoming a poet, and to go with the master to learn more about this craft. He gets the approval to do so and goes on this journey, and I think there's so many reflections here of Hesse's own life, his kind of striving to be a poet himself. He was a poet before he was writing novels, and he continued to write poetry his whole life. But kind of like we see Verregaut in Rossheld needing to commit to his painting, his artistry, and finds it difficult to sustain a family and his life. Han Fuke never ends up being able to return back to that life, and there's some slight regret to it. He goes back to the town that he's from, and the bride has passed away, his father's no longer there, and he's filled with rage. He even has thoughts of killing the master at learning this, but comes to the conclusion there's no real way back from this, and it was still the right path to take. And I feel like the descriptions of the river in this are little inklings of Siddhartha coming through too. So at the end of the story, he's coming back to the river where the festival was and says, "He looked into the river where floated the mirrored images of the 1,000 lamps, and just as he could no longer distinguish between the reflections and reality, so he found in his soul no difference between the festival and that first one when he had stood there as a youth and heard the words of the strange master." And this doubt of the journey, but having to follow it through, is kind of echoed in many stories in this book. So the next one, The Flute Dream, so this is the one that's added in the later translations, but was written in 1914, so still kind of pre-war writing, which for Hesse is a lot more innocent. And in The Flute Dream, his father misunderstands what it means to play the flute and be a musician, but his son goes along with it, and so he's taken this path that isn't necessarily his vision and his direction of where he wants to go, but he doesn't want to disappoint people, so he goes ahead with it. And he meets a girl within this and travels through the woods, but the imagery in it is kind of similar when he's talking about the river and the doubts that he's having around turning back and going back to his life. And he's already starting to blur the boundaries between dreaming and what's happening in reality, as after he's had all of these experiences with the man who's guiding him and with Bridget, he describes having a premonition where the wandering, the girl, his father, his homeland was all just a dream. And he says, "I knew that I must not call the man, and recognition of truth came over me like a chill. To make sure of what I already suspected, I leaned out over the water and lifted the lantern, and out of the black watery mirror a face peered up at me. A face with a severe and solemn features and grey eyes, an old knowing face, and it was I. And since no way led back, I voyaged forth over the dark waters deeper into the night." So again we have the water, the lanterns, it's very much leading on from the poet. Now things change a bit from this point onwards, because it's clear the war has then started. And Hesse's relationship to the war changed throughout the years. He initially started off quite in favour of Germany, he even volunteered for military service, but became more and more disillusioned with it, and it ended in quite an anti-nationalist stance. I'm planning to do a deep dive into Hesse's thoughts on the war and politics, because there's a lot to cover and it relates to so many of his different books. I'll do that soon so there's not too much repetition, but Hesse at the start of the war was already living in Switzerland. Now, while he's intending to be supportive, he writes one news article in particular. There's a few that he writes, but there's one in particular that had a big influence in how he was perceived in Germany. And this was, "Oh friends, none of these tones." And I don't think he meant for this to be so controversial, but it was an essay that fueled an enormous amount of heat against him, to the point that he was receiving a lot of hate mail, people were refusing to receive his books, and it's already a difficult time for him with all the things going on that I explained at the beginning of the video. And so in 1915 he tries another take, which is the short story that this whole book is named after, Strange News from Another Star. Now the story begins in an imaginary planet where there's just been a huge earthquake and everything has been destroyed. They no longer have any flowers on this star, and they're wanting them to be able to bury the dead properly that have died as a result of the earthquake. And so they're trying to decide who should volunteer, and the king ends up selecting this young boy who travels to another star and is then witnessing the horrors of war. And there's so many parallels between the two places, and it's very much, Hesse didn't want to identify as a pacifist, but I would say it's a pacifist telling of a story. And the boy ends up fleeing back to his own star, and he's kind of horrified around humanity, the brutal nature in which they're killing others, which kind of makes sense as to why in Strange News from Another Planet they chose to add in "if the war continues," but I'll cover that properly in amongst the war and politics video. But the war, with all the hate mail and also just the horrific nature that war brings in, was having a huge impact on Hesse's mental health. He ends up having a severe nervous breakdown, and so 1916 is when he's beginning his psychoanalysis sessions with J.B. Lang. And we can instantly see this reflected back in the work. So the next poems that are in this book are A Dream Sequence, which was in 1916, and Faldum, also in 1916. Now, A Dream Sequence, as you might be able to tell from the title, is much more surreal. He's pulling and playing on dreams that he's having, as your subconscious is a huge part of Carl Jung's theories and psychoanalysis as a whole. And this combination of Hesse and Jungian concept is what I think is part of what makes his work so special. And I wouldn't say he has perfected it in this book, but Damien is probably a great example of where we see some of these psychoanalytical concepts coming to life. And these short stories that are published in the same year give us a bit more of a taste of what's to come in Damien, if you're wanting to read the books in order. Faldum, however, is a little different. So he's playing with the theory of metamorphosis again, which he's written about before in some of his other tales. So Faldum begins explaining the village of Faldum and describing the different people running around there. And then it becomes clear that in the marketplace there's a man who sells these magic mirrors. And you get to hear all of the wishes that the townspeople, the children, are making as they kind of look into these mirrors and make a wish. And there's a few different ones that happen, but the metamorphosis part of it comes in to the two men who go. So one's a violinist, and when he's asked for his wish, he wants a violin that's so marvellous everyone would come from afar to hear him play. And his friend, the other young man, when asked, is then a little disgruntled at having his friend taken away and says, "Now you have taken the violinist away from me," the youth said. "I want nothing from life but to listen and watch, and I would like to think only about what is immortal, and so I would like to be a mountain as big as the countryside of Faldum, and so tall that my summit would tower above the clouds." And his wish comes true and he becomes a mountain. And I think this is echoing Hesse's sense of isolation at the time, as 1916 is the year that Hesse's own father passed away. So Hesse was very isolated, his marriage had broken down already, and so there's this real sense of loneliness, and he's also starting to become more aware of his age as well. as in 1916 he's close to approaching 40. And this is echoed in the mountain that the young man becomes too. And while there are descriptions in this of the mountain itself, the nature, the way that the rivers flow through it, I think you'd quite like it if you're a fan of Peter Kamenzian, his first novel, with how well he's describing the outdoor scenery around him. But as time goes by, the city below him has turned to complete ruin. Now, whether or not it's representing part of the war and the destruction that can have is up for debate. I mean, there are lines such as, he saw the hunters discard their crossbows and take up firearms, which connecting in war and the Industrial Revolution that's happening in Germany at the time as well. But he talks about the thing that worries him most, which is, the ages had slipped by and behold the mountain had grown old. When he saw the sun rise and move across the sky and depart, it was not the way it had once been, and when he saw the stars reflected in the pale glaciers, he no longer felt himself their equal. Neither the sun nor the stars were any longer especially important to him. What was important now was what was happening to himself and within himself. For he could feel deep beneath the cliffs and caverns an alien hand at work. Hard primitive rock grew friable and weathered into flaky slates and streams as waterfalls ate their way deeper. And he talks about the mountain withdrawing more and more into himself, which is reflective of what's happening to Hesse at the time as well. He initially, after the amount of hate he's receiving for his commentary on war, retreats for a little bit and kind of becomes quite reclusive. He refrains from making any commentary on anything. I think he may even have stopped his book reviews at this time. I mean, he does come back with a bang and is a lot more aggressive, but not for a little while yet. So I think he's still in this seclusion stage when he's writing Faldum. And there's some sadness echoed in the text as well, as he's saying, and it happened that in his advanced age he also remembered men again. Not that he thought of men as equals, but he began to look about for them. He began to feel abandoned and to think about the past. And he describes being really pained whenever he recalls the memory of men. But the saving grace is when he's lost in these memories and he's thinking about men and looking out for them, he hears a song and someone comes back again to offer him a wish. And Faldum's wish at the very end, I'll read to you now. And he made a wish, a silent wish, and as he did so, he was freed from the torment of having to think about all those lost and distant things, and everything fell from him that had caused him pain. The mountain collapsed, and with it the country, and where Faldum had been. The illimitable sea tossed and roared, and over it, in steady alternation, moved the sun and stars. Now, Hesse is someone who struggled with suicide and really contemplated it multiple times throughout his life. It was a thing that meant he was institutionalized back in his youth, but these kind of depressive episodes would plague him for the rest of his life. But Faldum isn't the last time that Hesse is exploring these themes of metamorphosis. Now, while in Faldum it has a bit of a sadder ending to it, there are some more positive ones. So the most obvious would be Pictor's Metamorphosis. And so the copies in the UK, I have another one as well actually, and they both have them, include The Other Fantasies, which contains many of Hesse's other short stories and fairy tales throughout different years. And you can really see how his style changes throughout the years as well. So pre the war, it's more simplistic style, folk tales. I think he's kind of inspired by Brothers Grimm, Arabian Nights. Hoffmann was a big influence for him as well. Hesse was someone that was very well read and published book reviews his entire life. But once the war breaks out and once he starts psychoanalysis, the tales become much more surreal. And there's themes here of him anthropomorphizing things, whether it's Tale of the Wicker Chair, Conversations with a Stove, and these are really highlighting the themes of isolation that Hesse is feeling in these years as well. And kind of shows how much the isolation that he was craving, that's coming across in Nulp and in Rossheld, was actually becoming quite difficult for him. But Pictor's Metamorphosis is when things change, and this story is a little more romantic. So I think it was published in 1922, but it was a tale that was written for his second wife, Ruth Wenger. Now, Ruth was a singer. She was quite a bit younger than Hesse, but as we could see in Faldum already, he's kind of feeling a lot older than he wants to be, and I think she represented so much youth and freshness to him. This is a tale that he wrote that's quite surreal. We see a lot of animals and plants changing form in this magical world, and a boy has a transition and becomes a tree, and he's saddened by this initially. He feels that there's this curse of loneliness, and he's unable to move, and you really feel kind of the pain of solitude in it. But then a girl comes across, and the curse of solitude is broken. Now, it wasn't widely published at the time. Originally, it was handwritten by Hesse, and he illustrated all of these gorgeous paintings around it. And he did make some physical copies by hand for his friends. And then years later, he became really fond of these, and if he ever saw them in stores, he'd try and buy them again, with an aim to have them released. Unfortunately, my copy doesn't have the paintings in it, but one day I'll have an illustrated copy. And it's a much more romantic example of metamorphosis, and it's quite nice to see him coming out of that journey. I wish I could say the same for his marriage. The two ended up separating quite soon after they were married. I think he was already hesitant to go into it. I mean, that's clear from his other books. But her family were, I think, quite significant in helping him get full Swiss citizenship, which was important with all of the wars, and helped fund some of the costs around this as well. But from the biographies I've read, it sounded a little bit like he was having a crush on her mother as well. So yeah, complicated marriage, that one. But back to Strange News from Another Star. So the story that I skipped over, The Hard Passage, and I did this intentionally because I believe it was published in 1917, so after the other two, which was translated as well by Jack Sipes in the larger fairy tale collection, but I think the name of it changes to, I think, The Difficult Path, but it's the same story that follows a man who's on a hike with a guide. Now, this guide is quite odd from the beginning. When I read this, the guide's voice to me came across like Gollum. That's how I was narrating it in my head. As they're going through difficult paths, and the guide says, "Nasty, nasty to go this way, nasty to force oneself through this cheerless rocky entrance, to stride across this cold brook, to climb up into darkness on this narrow ragged gorge." I don't know, there's something in the way things were worded that I kept picturing Gollum, even though he's a bit taller. But he's a really suspicious character, this guide. I'll read for you some of the descriptions. So, he looked down at me with a smile. There was neither derision nor sympathy in the smile, neither harshness nor compassion. There was nothing there but understanding, nothing but knowledge. That smile said, "I know you. I know your fear and how you feel, and I have by no means forgotten your boastings of yesterday and the day before. Every rabbity dodge of cowardice your soul is now indulging in, every flirtatious glance at the lovely sunshine out there is well known and familiar to me before you act it out." And he describes himself as loving and hating this guide. And there's quite a few times in this journey that the walker is not wanting to continue. He's hoping that if this is a dream or a nightmare, by a yelling stop, he'd be able to wake up and escape it. Instead, he says, "The guide stopped and looked across at me in silence, without reproach, but with that dreadful understanding of his, with that unbearable knowledge and presentiment, that having completely understood in advance." And he asked the boy if he'd rather head back, and inside he's thinking, "Yes, yes, please take me back." But he's unable to voice it. He says, "I wanted to shout yes, though I knew very well that I could not do it." And so he has to continue, and he feels some resentment towards the guide and some sadness as well, as he feels all of the hometown and the valleys below him that he can see, and all of the things that he once loved now becoming sickening to him. And despite it being such a frightening journey, they do reach the summit of the mountain, and they come across a bird. It's sitting at the top of the tree that's at the summit, a blackbird. And he says, "The bird sang harshly. Its harsh song signified eternity, eternity." The blackbird sang, and its blank hard eyes stared at us like a black crystal. Hard to bear was its gaze, hard to bear was its song. Above, all were the loneliness and emptiness of that place, the expanse of the barren heavens. To die was inconceivable bliss. To stay there, nameless pain. Something must happen, at once, instantly, otherwise we and the world would turn to stone from sheer horror. And he goes on to say, "Suddenly the bird whirled, plunged headlong into space. With a leap my guide dived into the blue, fell towards the flashing heavens, and flew away. Now the wave of fate had reached its peak. Now it tore away my heart, now it broke in silence. And I was already falling. I plunged, leaped, I flew. Wrapped in a cold vortex I shot, blissful and palpitating with ecstatic pain, down through infinity to the mother's breast. So a much darker telling, and I think the bird that's introduced to it kind of links us into Damien as well, with the bird dream sequences playing quite a prominent feature in his writing from this point forward. But there's still one more in this that I haven't yet discussed. Iris. Now, Iris is written in 1918 and I think is very Hesse-coded, as he begins the story discussing the iris flower, which he refers to as a sword lily, which was one of his mother's flowers that grew in the garden. Now we see Anselm, the protagonist in this story, grow up. So he's a child at the beginning in his mother's garden, and he goes through school and ends up becoming a teacher, and he meets through his friend's sister, Iris, who he feels he has fallen in love with. She's quite a bit older than him, which is significant, and he ends up offering her his hand in marriage. Now, my thoughts on this story is that Iris is very much representing his first marriage to Maria Bernoulli. So Maria was approximately 9 years his senior, and in the short story he says she was older than he would have wished for his wife to be. So that's the first tie-in we have. And he goes on to describe how difficult she would be to live with and how odd she is. He says she was odd and it would be difficult to live with her and pursue his academic ambitions, with which she had no sympathy at all. Also, she was not very robust or healthy, and in particular could not easily enjoy company and parties. By preference, she lived in lonely quiet, amid flowers, music and books, letting the world go its way or come to her if it must. Sometimes her sensitivity was so acute that when something alien wounded her, she would burst into tears. Now, here's why I think this is so significant. So in Rothalde, which is his fourth book, he kind of breaks down the struggles and details of his marriage, represented through the characters Johann Vergut and Adele. Now Adele is representing Mia, which is a nickname for Maria, which I'll get onto in a second. But he's describing his wife Adele and part of the reason why they're not working together to his friend Otto. And he says, "You know, I had difficulties with my wife from the first. For a few years it was bearable, not good, not bad. But I was disappointed and I didn't hide it very well. I kept demanding the thing that Adele was unable to give. She was never very lively. She was solemn and heavy. I might have noticed it sooner. When there was trouble, she was never able to look the other way or make light of it. When I was with her, she was timid, yielding and silent. She received my outbursts of rage or of gaiety with the same equanimity, and when I was away from her, she sat by herself playing the piano, thinking of her life as a young girl. The outcome was that I put myself more and more in the wrong." And Hesse talks about Mia and Adele as them kind of not wanting to be super sociable and host a lot of parties, which is very much what he's kind of writing about with Iris in this story. And so I believe Hesse in Iris is trying to rewrite what happens, as when he's asking Iris for her hand in marriage, she questions him and gets him to think about, she kind of gives him this task to make him understand why it is he's so drawn to her. And she's really hesitant about this proposal as well. She's saying she's more difficult than most other women and says, "Oh, listen to me carefully. Everything that now seems a toy to you is life itself for me, and would have to be so to you too. And everything you strive for and worry about is for me a toy. In my eyes, it's not worth living for. I shall not change, Anselm, for I live according to an inner law, but will you be able to change? And you would have to change completely if I were to be your wife." Now, when she's talking about the things that he's striving for not meaning anything to her, it's significant as well, as the two of them got together while Hesse was really young. So it was before Peter Kamenzian had reached any real success. They go on a trip to Italy together when he's researching his monographs that he did on artists and St. Francis of Assisi as well. And so when they first meet, Maria comes from a really successful family and was a pioneer in the photography world, where Hesse hadn't really made a true name for himself. The poems that he'd written at that time were not very successful, and so she was very much the more accomplished one in the relationship. And so as time went on, she kind of viewed a lot of his writing to be quite vain, which you can only imagine how much of a burn this would have felt like. But with Anselm, after seeing him grow up, we already know that his mother has passed away, as he describes her laying in a flower-covered coffin. And his mother in this passes away before he's mentioning his friend's sister Iris. Now, Hesse's own mother died in 1902, and this was really difficult for Hesse, as they didn't have the best relationship. He was always kind of seeking approval from her that he never really got. Now, when he meets Iris, he's saying to her all of these words of praise and so many loving compliments, but he adds in, "Iris is a wonderful name, and I have no idea what it reminds me of." Now, Hesse's mother was named Maria, the same name of Maria, who he then falls in love with. The two do look kind of similar. I mean, this is open to interpretation, but I'll include some pictures for you to decide that. And when he's saying he doesn't know what Iris's name reminds him of, Iris says, "But you do know that the blue and yellow sword lilies are called that," which are his favourite flowers from his mother's garden. And he says, "Yes, I know it very well, and that in itself is beautiful, but always when I pronounce your name, it seems to remind me of something else. I don't know what, as though it were connected to some very deep, distant, important memories, and yet I don't know what they might be, and cannot seem to find out." But Anselm starts to push. He's saying to Iris that he can't go on living this way, he needs a wife, otherwise his life would be empty and meaningless. And she makes the reply of, "That is a sign. Often you have said to me that whenever you speak my name, you are reminded of a forgotten something that was once important and holy in your eyes." His mother. "That is a sign, Anselm, and it is what has drawn you to me all these years. I too believe you have lost and forgotten something important and holy in your soul, something that must be reawakened before you can find happiness and attain what is intended for you." And she begs him to go and find what it is that's reminding him of her name and being. And so he takes this task on, but he's finding it really difficult. But he doesn't want to give up, as he's keen to win Iris's heart. And after trying and trying to remember, he says, he went over his memories, which he had believed to be stored away in good order, and made amazing and startling discoveries. His treasury of memories was a great deal smaller than he would have surmised. Whole years were missing, and when he thought back, they stood there as empty as blank pages. He found that they had great difficulty in summoning up a clear image of his mother. And so in the story of Iris, the two don't end up marrying each other, and he's kind of rewriting what he later realised in how potentially him getting with Mia, marrying, having children, trying to live together, was actually him kind of searching for that mother figure in his life. And you can see how needed the role of a mother is in some of his earlier novels as well. Beneath the Wheel is maybe a good example of that. And it's something that Hesse does often in his fiction. He kind of mixes parts of his own experience in with that of fiction. He's kind of retelling stories, and sometimes I feel he's rewriting them as a kind of personal release for himself, as he does seem to create these worlds that he's living in. But yeah, Iris for me was him retelling the marriage to his first wife and how he potentially wishes it had worked out instead, as the divorce was very messy for the two of them. Mia would go on to have really severe mental health for the rest of her life, and the transition time for Hesse was really difficult as well. But that summarises my thoughts on Strange News from Another Star. It's also the name of a song by Damon Albarn, so he's the guy from Blur. He was a really big fan of Hesse, and the song name is a tribute to him, which, I mean, Hesse's had such a remarkable influence on 60s music in particular, less so on the Britpop scene, so nice to see some connections there. Well, actually, I completely forgot I didn't say anything on the short story that was added into the 90s edition, A Man by the Name of Zagler. So I'll give you the quick overview on this one, as there's some early notion here of him being kind of sick of the middle class. It's a little bit of a commentary on it. It follows the man Zagler, who goes to a museum, and behind the museum rope there's these medieval artifacts, and there's a sign that says not to touch them, but as no one's there he ignores it and he takes some of the things there, including a little pill. He leaves the museum and he's playing with it in his pocket, and then he goes to a restaurant, and on a spur of the moment decision he decides to consume the pill. He then enters a zoo only to find that after having taken this pill, he now has the ability to communicate with animals. He's understanding what they're thinking, and they're all looking down on him. They're kind of viewing him with disdain, and I think there's reflections there on how Hesse views the middle class that kind of comes to its peak in Steppenwolf. So if you're a Steppenwolf fan, you might appreciate some of the disdain that the animals have for him. My particular favourite was one of the animals he includes in this is a moose. And moose are by far my favourite animal. I feel so lucky to be alive at the same time that they are. I just think they're magical creatures. My mind is blown whenever I see them. Like, the size of them is so hard to properly comprehend, and they always, in a photo, yeah, they look big, but the scale of them is quite hard to understand. I almost feel like they should belong in the Ice Age, but I have so much love for moose, so the fact that they were mentioned in a story by my favourite author was probably a highlight to me. But it's a really short story. It isn't anything groundbreaking, but it does connect with Hesse's themes there on how he views people and the assumptions that he makes in how animals might view them too, as he has quite a pantheist approach or view in a lot of his novels, especially earlier on in his life, pre the war, which is when I believe this one was written. So yes, I think we've covered them all between the two. I know, well, if the war continues, you will have to wait. If you're curious about his other stories, I know that, I think his name's Donovan on YouTube, does a lot of audio recordings of many of Hesse's fairy tales, so you can access them that way. I think the short stories in this I'll probably cover and bring up in a bit more detail in certain other works where they're relating. Unless there's any in particular you'd like me to discuss, let me know. I'd be happy to dive into some in more depth. Thanks for being here if you made it to the end of the video, and if you've read either of these, I'd be curious to know anyone's thoughts. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Take care. Bye.